And again, I'm James Ford, and I'm the guiding teacher of Empty Moon Zen. Today, I would like to explore Zen, maps of the spiritual life, and of course, the fat guy. People take up Zen for any number of reasons, but those who stay find they're on a spiritual quest. Words like enlightenment and awakening, they become the holy grail of that quest. And images shift. We can feel we're crossing deserts in quest of an oasis with life-giving waters, possibly only to find shimmering mirages on the horizon quickly disappearing as we approach. Grail, oasis, mirage. Fortunately, there are maps for this journey. Probably the most famous within Zen are the 10 ox-herding pictures. They show how a student of the intimate way starts on the spiritual path, has various encounters of ever-deepening insight, passing through, this is Zen, both emptiness and nature, and finally end up a fat guy carrying a bag of presents into the village. Of all the images of awakening, Zen's best-known map presents a fat guy and that bag of presents. On my own exploration of the intimate way, I've learned a lot from that particular map, but it has gaps. Critically, it doesn't show any of the traps and snares we encounter when we throw ourselves into this way. And sadly, the way is littered with traps. Also, it's misleading in another sense. The stages of the 10 ox-herding pictures become, well, stages. You pass through one, then another, and finally, eventually, you get to be the fat guy. My problem with this is, well, that's actually not how it works. The intimate way is a bit like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's famous 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, arguing, depression, and at the very end, acceptance. People also quickly noticed how this list can apply to dying. And anyone who has been around grief or dying knows it's way messier than that simple arc suggests. One of the great lessons for me, relatively early on my way, involved an old friend who had died from complications of AIDS. Something rarer now, but in that time simply the end of a progression that did not have alternatives. I tell this story with some regularity, and if you've heard it, I apologize. But I tell it because it's important. It was important for me. It can be important for you. A friend of my friend came to visit as he was dying and was telling my friend he had missed an important stage on the process. I no longer remember. Anger, maybe bargaining, something somewhere in the middle. He was quite insistent that it be met. My friend, the dying person, said, "You don't understand. I am the path." And the insistent friend was not invited back. Dr. Kubler-Ross's list holds up some incredibly true things we encounter in our lives, especially in hard moments: denial, anger, arguing, depressions, and acceptance. But there is no simple and clear progression. They come in the order they come. Some are revisited over and over, and some may not be part of a particular person's path at all. For most of us, we get several at once, and even that final moment, acceptance, turns out to be a temporary resting place, to which we come, leave, and if we're lucky, return again. And then, again, maybe. Now, of the traditional paths of Zen's awakening, my favorite actually has to be Dongshan's 5 ranks, in part because they actually aren't ranks. They are 5 faces of the real. Sadly, they don't include the snares and traps along the way either. Instead, they simply represent differing angles on what in the ox herding pictures we see as the fat guy. They become reminders of who we are as we truly are, and that's mutable, shifting, sometimes a mirage, sometimes the oasis, sometimes a cracked vessel, sometimes the grail itself. This is also why I'm increasingly uncomfortable with the term spiritual bypassing. It's an attempt, and an important attempt, at addressing the conundrum of spiritual teachers doing bad things. It describes people on the path who miss steps along the way, and because of those missing experiences, they need to go back at some point and address them. Usually these are issues of psychological maturity, or at least insight into one's character. And according to the model, if they don't, well, they will necessarily be dangerous. Dangerous for themselves, and if they're teachers, dangerous to others. Cascades of sadness can follow a spiritual teacher who does not see their own shadows. But the worm in that particular apple is that the premise is wrong. And, well, garbage in. The wrong premise is that supposed map up to the top of the mountain. In the rarefied atmosphere at the top, one's poop should not stink. But that's not true. It isn't the way things are. On the Zen way, we're pointed to the fact that our liberation is nowhere except here. The beginning and the end are in fact not different. In both my observation and my experience, the way does not ascend to Vulture Peak nor Mount Carmel. If you want to insist on a direction, it's more downward. It's a journey to depth. Here, enlightenment becomes endarkenment. It is the way of not knowing. However, even if that bit of geography is less misleading, if we cling to it, it's wrong too. I think the best analogy of the spiritual path is that it is like a game of chutes and ladders. There's more than an element of chance. You roll the wrong dice and you slide to the bottom. You roll the right dice and you end up at the top. Maybe if your perspective is broad enough, you can see all the near infinite varieties of the dance of causality, and with that, chance isn't a good word. But if you live in the world most of us occupy, it very much looks like you do what you can do, and after that, it's in the hands of the gods. I started digging around, and it turns out Chutes and Ladders is the name Milton Bradley gave to an ancient Indian board game called Snakes and Ladders, chutes being less disturbing than snakes for the intended audience. The origins of Snakes and Ladders, or Moksha Patam, is lost to antiquity. It's always a children's game. The element of pure luck can bore adults. But it has maybe always had a spiritual side. Hindus, Jains, and Buddhists, and later Christians, have all used it to teach morality. In the oldest strata, it appears to teach karma, desire, and destiny. According to the Wikipedia article on Snakes and Ladders, the ladders were associated with virtues such as generosity, grace, and success, while the snakes represented vices like lust, anger, theft, and murder. An interesting footnote to it is how more of the 100 squares behind the Snakes and Ladders are snakes. The way of virtue is always harder. The Wikipedia article offers as well a tantalizing sentence. Quote, "There has even been evidence of a possible Buddhist version of the game existing in India during the Palasena time period." I looked that up, the period between the 8th and 13th centuries. I also found an article about a Tibetan version of the game, Ascending to the Spiritual Levels. If you're concerned about the luck aspect of this, I recall the guidance of several of my teachers that awakening is actually always an accident. You can't attribute any specific cause that precipitates the great eruptions of our hearts. However, our practices do make us accident prone. And I suggest these practices for us include the great disciplines of meditation, but also the container of an ethical life, for us captured in the 16 Bodhisattva precepts, and of course, the image of awakening, that thing that is not what you think, the fat guy. And so, while I'm fond of snakes and ladders, it ain't it either. I suggest, if we want a glimpse at our spiritual path, to kind of mush up several maps. Today, two from two different traditions. First, those 10 Oxfording pictures. The first is undertaking the path, then catching sight of some footprints, 3, having a glimpse of our true nature, 4, discovering it full, 5, learning to cultivate the encounter, 6, riding it home, 7, dropping all images, 8, dropping the sense of self at the center, 9, finding the source, and 10, the fat guy. Each of these are worth endless unpacking. But again, they miss some things. And so here I find myself pulled to John Bunyan's English Puritan spiritual classic, Pilgrim'S Progress, and its sequel, which corrects for some serious errors in the first part. In part 1, we find, along with that impulse to enter the way, first, resistance of those around us as we experience the calling of our hearts. Then, needing spiritual guides, maps, and human teachers. Third, noticing false friends, holding on to old truths, and mistaking brass for gold. I recall a reference to someone willing to consider anything, so long as it was sufficiently unlikely. Then, there's despondency. In earlier Christian mysticism, this is called acedia, the noonday devil. It's characterized as restlessness and inability to focus. It can also be experienced as being overwhelmed by our own personal shortcomings and failures. Then we're warned about secularism. For me, this is tumbling into a bare materialism, missing the live animal of our experience. I also think of it as settling for the calmness or relaxation in the midst of the activities of our lives. A gift, but not the goal. Here we are wise to 6, look to the ancestors, to familiarize ourselves with the ancient maps and the pointers on the way. And then at some point we come to 7. Various graces, encounters, awakenings. They are blessings on the way, unless, of course, we hold on to them. They are meant to be experienced and then let go of. They are intimations of the deep. But if we hold them too tightly, they become false gods. Actually, we encounter a host of traps. Number 8, the most dangerous of which are getting caught up in the forms and falling into hypocrisy, letting our outer and inner lives bifurcate. Then, avoiding the whispers of failure and what seems an inevitable tumbling into the dark night of the soul. Here, nothing makes sense, and despair rules over all. One can only trudge on as if walking through mud. And then we encounter our own last temptations, each cut to our own shape. In Nikos Kazantzakis' novel and the film adaptation of The Last Temptation of Christ, Jesus' last temptation is to come down from the cross, marry Mary Magdalene, and live a long and ordinary life. In the Buddhist version, Mara whispers to Siddhartha during that final night, that he has realized the great insight, and now he should just retire to a cave and enjoy the delights of awakening without the messiness of involving himself with the world. With either temptation, with any temptation, the only solution is to trudge on. The watchword is always watching, noticing, returning. For us on the Zen way, the 10th trap is experiencing the great boundless, the emptiness of all things, and stopping there. But if we don't stop, then we do come to the fat guy. It turns out, as my dying friend said, the second part of Bunyan's saga reminds us of the holiness of the family and who would have thought the sacred feminine, although perhaps he wouldn't have thought of it all that way himself. Of course, this map comes with its own traps. Again, there is a directionality that is only partially true. But if we accept these things as maps and not the territory, then the way is thrown open for us. We take on our practice, we read the maps, we find guides, and we embark. Then, as the old joke goes, hilarity ensues. Mystery opens upon mystery. Things mush up, things fall out of order. We discover the end, and we find ourselves at the beginning. We discover the mess is for a lifetime, soup to nuts, birth to grave. And as my friend taught me all those years ago, we each of us can discover we are the path. I am the path. You are the path. Time and space and all of it a vast interdependent web. Nothing is excluded. All of it can be a blessing. The fat guy.